The Founding Fathers, American Revolution, our Constitution, our history, America. Thanks so much for tuning in as we discuss the people, places, events, and battles that turned 13 separate colonies into the greatest nation on earth, the United States. Welcome back, everybody, and before I jump into the 62nd episode, I want to take just a couple moments and share two quick updates. First, the Patriot Power Podcast has a totally new revamped website, and it's something that I am really excited about. It's cleaner, it's much easier to navigate, and for the first time, and as requested, all of my major series and projects are organized all in one place for you. So whether you are here for the Signers, Hidden Patriots, my Young Book series, Young Patriot book series, or episodes like this, it's much, much easier to explore and go deeper. I did spend a fair amount of time on it so that the benefits for you are easily accessible. So I really encourage you to check out patriotpowerpodcast.com. And secondly, as we move into a new year, I would like to pause and reflect very briefly on what this community has become, which is you guys and gals. This podcast has continued to grow way beyond what I ever expected, and the show has been listened to now in over 40 plus countries, and it's reaching people who care deeply about history, liberty, and the human stories that are behind the American Revolution. The podcast crossed major listening milestones, including, this is pretty cool, reaching our 500,000th listener. And that kind of reach is pretty humbling for me when I consider that this started as a simple idea that was driven by curiosity and respect for the past, especially after researching and finding Peter Kern. And I didn't even know if anybody would be interested in hearing me talk, but since I do have the perfect face for radio, I thought, why not? And I'm really glad I did. It's my passion, and I love sharing it, and I'm just feel blessed that people are listening. But what matters most to me is not necessarily the numbers themselves, but the fact that these actual stories of all these people are being heard, and such amazing stories of ordinary men and women, and the families and the sacrifice and the hard decisions that shaped this country. And knowing that people like you all around the world are taking time to listen tells me that this time in our American history still matters. And with the growth and some exposure that my podcast has been getting, there have been opportunities to monetize this show in ways that would help my bank account for sure. But those opportunities would also give others a say in the topics, direction, and the content. And if you've listened for any length of time, you know that sharing this history is my passion. And I believe that passion does not need money to fuel it. And because of that, I have chosen to turn down all of those offers, and I believe this history deserves to be told freely and truthfully, and that matters more to me than sponsorship control. And that said, you still can support me and support the show by donating to help offset some of the time and costs involved, and you can do that through the website. And with that, let us get into today's episode, which I am really, really excited about. One, because many people have asked and emailed me, what do you have any ancestors? What about your ancestors that you talk about and that's on your website and such? And I can't believe I've waited this long to talk about Peter Kern. And that's what this episode is about. You're going to learn about him. You're going to learn about some private moments that I had at his gravesite and battles that he endured and took part in. And, when people think about the American Revolution, I think many often picture Minutemen dropping their tools and rushing toward the sound of gunfire. And although that image is real, it's not the whole story. There was a whole nother group of men, far less famous and far less romanticized, who were just as important and essential to the survival of the revolution. And they were part of what was called the Pennsylvania Flying Camp. One of those men was Peter Kern, and he was born in Pennsylvania in 1748. His father was Johann George Kern, and his mother was Katharina Deschler. This Peter Kern is my fifth great-grandfather, who truly ignited my passion even more about the people, the places, and the battles, and everything involved in the American Revolution. Peter was raised in a farming community shaped by German-descended families and had a strong sense of responsibility to one's neighbors, attended church, and like most men of his generation, he was not raised to be a soldier, right? He was there to work, provide, and quietly contribute to the stability of his community. It was very community-driven back then. Wouldn't that be awesome if that's how it was today? That sense of stability disappeared rather quickly because by 1776, the colonies were no longer arguing with Britain. They were actually preparing for war. British pressure in both New York and New Jersey pretty much left Pennsylvania exposed, and General George Washington needed manpower quickly, but the Continental Army alone was not going to be enough, which is why the colonies created the flying camp. And unlike the Minutemen, who were local militia trained to defend their local towns and respond to nearby threats for short periods of time, the flying camp was more of a regional rapid response force whose men were called up for extended service and pretty much sent wherever the danger was the greatest, and most likely it was not near their home. Minutemen guarded their communities, but flying camp soldiers left theirs behind. So when you were in the flying camp, it did mean longer absences from family, uncertainty about pay and supplies, really difficult marching, exposure to the elements, and no clear sense of how the war would unfold. Peter Kern served in the flying camp for 6 months, from July through December of 1776, and that was during one of the most dangerous and uncertain periods of the entire war, right? The beginning. And for Peter, service in the flying camp didn't start off with a battle or gunfire. It began with a march, days and days on the road with damp wool, worn shoes, very little food, and no certainty of where they're even going to go next, because they were told to go here, then they went there, and then they were told to go. It was kind of scattered, but it was needed because you kind of had a roving patrol, and that's what these flying camps were. And there were other flying camps. Obviously, I'm focused on the one that my grandfather was in, but nights were spent, just like many of the soldiers, on super cold ground, makeshift camps. And when I say makeshift camps, don't picture beautiful tents and little stoves inside of it. I mean, if you had a sheet tied to a tree and you could get under it, that's probably more realistic. And they were listening to rumors that traveled faster than the orders that reached them. And so by the time the battle came, they were already tired and exhausted. That 6-month window placed Peter Kern in the middle of the revolution's earliest defeats or disasters, however you want to frame that. In late August, the flying camp was part of the American force facing the British during the Battle of Long Island. Some people call it the Battle of New York. It was the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. More men fought at Long Island than in any other single engagement of the entire conflict. And the result was not great. It was devastating for the American cause. British forces, which obviously were better supplied and better trained, they overwhelmed the American lines. They forced a very chaotic retreat, while thousands of American soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. And the Continental Army itself narrowly avoided total destruction. The records that I uncovered during all of my research on Peter Kern connected his service records to being present and taking part in the Battle of Long Island campaign, and it showed that he was either wounded, killed, or captured. Now, I know he wasn't killed because I know what year he died. So he was either captured or injured, and I wish it told me, but it didn't. The surviving documentation doesn't say it. It's, he's either wounded, captured, or killed, but either possibility places him basically smack dab in the middle of the chaos in that battle. And he would have been seeing a lot of things that we can't imagine. He would have a lot of confusion, retreat, wounded men that had been killed, super loud cannonades, and probably a sobering realization that, you know what, this independence thing, it ain't going to be quick. And Long Island was not a moment of triumph, right? It was a moment of survival. My initial thought is that he was injured and then released, but that is absolutely just a hunch of mine. No factual or historical data to support that. I'm hoping that because it was actually much better to be injured than to be a prisoner, especially if you were sent to ships or prison camps. And can you imagine being out there saying, if I get not killed, hopefully, right? But if something happens to me, I hope that I'm shot and injured rather than becoming a prisoner. I mean, those are two bad options. But really back then, being sent to a hospital would be a much better option than being taken prisoner, because any soldier that was captured during and after the Battle of Long Island, that experience was grim and pretty deadly. Most prisoners that were taken at Long Island were not sent inland to traditional prison camps, right? They were held in and around New York City, which the British controlled after the battle. And the conditions were brutal by anybody's standards. Many prisoners were confined in makeshift land prisons, including churches, warehouses, and sugar houses. One of the most notorious was called the Sugar House Prison. And men were packed like sardines. They were fed barely, and they were exposed to complete filth, and they were denied medical care. So you take all of these men, some wounded, some sick, some fine, but they were just captured, and cram them into a very small quarter. What happens? Diseases would spread daily, and deaths were not like every other day. I mean, it was many times daily, and it was very, very common that if you got sent to a prisoner camp, it was a death sentence. And even worse than that, if you can imagine, were the British prison ships that were anchored in the waters around New York Harbor, particularly in Wallabout Bay, which is near present-day Brooklyn. The most infamous of these ships was called the HMS Jersey. And all of these ships were decommissioned warships that they took all the rigging and ventilation and everything out of them that they could use. And basically they were large cans to hold prisoners below deck. Now get this, 8,000 to 15,000 prisoners of war died on the ship because the conditions were horrendous. they were like the sugar houses. They were crammed into dark area, no air holes. They had very little, if any, fresh water, and they were given minimal food. And when I say minimal food, I don't mean a plate with small helpings. If you could get a half of a biscuit or half of an apple, a quarter of an apple, I mean, it was brutal. So, disease and primarily smallpox, typhus, and dysentery, they would just let them get sick, let them die, and many bodies were routinely removed at night and buried in shallow graves along the shore. And with that many deaths, it's estimated that more American soldiers and sailors died on the prison ships than died in combat during the entire Revolutionary War. And I would say by a lot, because you have 8,000 to 15,000 people that died on those ships, and some estimates say that during battles it was anywhere between 3 and 5,000, if I remember correctly. So bottom line is, don't get caught, right? Don't become a prisoner. Now, some prisoners were later exchanged or they escaped, paroled, but many never survived long enough for that chance. And the people that did survive were often very young. They were strong. They had outside help. Some civilians would go and take food and things to the ship, but that's the luck of the draw there. So if Peter Kern was captured at Long Island, even briefly, this is the environment that he would have entered. It was not captivity with honor or structure. It was basically neglect, suffering, and constant proximity to death. If he was injured instead of captured, the battlefield hospitals of the time offered a little relief, not a whole much more, but better than the ships. But wounds were often untreated or poorly treated, and infection would set in. So, I mean, you have this dire situation. If you get captured, you're either going to a camp, you're going to a ship, you're not going to be taken care of, you're not going to be fed, you're not going to be consoled, not like today. It was brutal. Because it's real easy to see, a lot of thousands of men died on the prison ships. No, I mean, this was brutal. Brutal. And I can't fathom being one of those unfortunate, brave men that succumbed to those diseases. Either way, whether he was sent at a camp or he was injured and sent to a hospital, it placed Peter, my fifth great-grandfather, one of the men who endured that part of the revolution in a very unforgiving moment of the war. And I suppose it is irrelevant, but I wish I knew for sure one way or the other. I did a lot of research for prison records, who they kept and where they kept them, which is eye-opening. But I never found his name, and they weren't real good at record keeping back then. One, they just didn't care. Like, for instance, I wish it was like the records they kept at Valley Forge. Valley Forge has a really cool website. You just go to it. You can type in a name, and it will tell you if they were there or not. And I'll put that link in the show notes. But unfortunately for prison ships and prison camps and hospitals and things like that, they didn't really probably care to keep track of them. They weren't really taking care of them anyway, so why write their name down? It is difficult to appreciate just how close the revolution came to an end in 1776, because if Washington's army had been destroyed at Long Island or fully captured in the months that followed, there likely would not be a second year of war at all. And men like Peter Kern were not fighting for an idea that felt secure. They were fighting for something that could still disappear. How frightening would that be? I won't rank years of importance because I think all of the years of the American Revolution had amazing stories and horrific tragedies in every year. But 1776 was the start. A lot of amazing things did happen in this year. And if you haven't purchased or listened to 1776 by David McCullough, please do. I just finished listening to it for like the 8th time. It's so well done. I love his voice. He reads the whole thing. He's since passed away a couple years ago, but he's one of my favorite authors. So in the days, though, after Long Island, George Washington wrote to Congress, basically telling them the situation was dire and it's not looking good. He didn't try to disguise the defeat or even soften the danger. In his words, he wrote, quote, "Our situation is truly distressing. The check our detachment sustained on the 27th has dispirited too great a proportion of our troops." And Washington warned that the Army narrowly escaped destruction and made clear to the Congress that preserving it was now the single most important objective of the war. And men like Peter Kern were living the consequences of that reality on the ground, even as Washington put it into words for the leaders of this very fragile new nation. Between these battles, there were long stretches where nothing happened, and you would think, finally, I don't have to worry about going into battle. That's probably true, but some of those moments of waiting and nothing happening were the hardest because orders came slowly, if they came at all. The men had to wait in fields, along roads, in rough camps, not knowing whether they were going to be told to advance, retreat, or simply stay put. Supplies were uncertain. Pay was very irregular. And rumors filled the silence. And for Peter Kern and others like him, the revolution was not a constant clash of armies. It was a test of patience and resolve. And they had to do that one uneasy, scary day at a time. So the Army then withdrew north under constant pressure, and the danger didn't end with Long Island. One would hope it would, but nope. In October of 1776, the campaign continued into what became known as the Battle of White Plains, which was another desperate moment for the American cause. At White Plains, Washington attempted to slow down the advance of the British long enough to preserve what remained of the army. Fighting centered around high ground near Chatterton Hill, where the American forces, which included the flying camp and militia, they faced the disciplined British assaults. And the battle was not a clear victory for either side, but it did achieve something critical. It allowed Washington to withdraw again, keeping the army intact when total destruction of it was really a very real possibility. Peter Kern's continued service through this phase of the campaign placed him among men who were no longer hoping for a quick resolution. By this point, I think the war had revealed its true nature. Retreat, exhaustion, uncertainty, hunger, and the constant fear of being captured or killed became a part of daily life. Can you imagine every day wondering what you're going to do, where you're going to go, if you're going to go anywhere? Are you going to have anything to eat? Am I going to be captured? Am I going to be... It was crazy. If you can get your mindset to that, you can really appreciate what these people did for our country. But White Plains was yet another reminder that the war is not going to be won quick, and Washington realized at that point that the immediate objective was just keeping an army together and keeping it so that it can survive to fight another day. For me, I wonder if my great-grandfather actually ever saw George Washington, from a distance, riding on a horse, or maybe even up close. I don't know. George Washington personally commanded the campaign at White Plains, so if Peter did see him, it would be likely during that battle. But Washington frequently moved among positions and headquarters and lines of retreat, and soldiers occasionally caught sight of him as he rode past with aides and officers, probably with Knox and others. And still, the army was large and movements were scattered, and most common soldiers, which Peter Kern was a private, never really had direct contact with their commander in chief. And whether he saw Washington with his own eyes or not, which I hope he did, Peter lived and fought inside the decisions that Washington made in real time. And that alone placed him closer to history than most men ever come. As the campaign continued into the fall, the Pennsylvania Flying Camp was also involved in the defense of Fort Washington. And that took place in November 1776. Now, Fort Washington sat on the very tip, the northern tip of Manhattan, which was a very exposed earthwork surrounded by a lot of trees and forests and rocky hills, and it overlooked the Hudson River. It was cold, isolated, and increasingly cut off as British forces closed in. When the British did attack, American defenders were surrounded on multiple sides. And after very fierce fighting, the fort fell. Thousands of American soldiers were taken prisoner, many of whom, as you well know, would suffer terribly in the captivity, and many of them would die. For the men involved, there was no grand spectacle, basically fear, exhaustion, and whether Peter Kern was inside the fort itself or attached to the flying camp units that were supporting its defense, it was an environment that placed him up close and personal to that battle, and it was uncertain and unforgiving. And throughout this period, Peter Kern served in Captain Nicholas Kern's company, drawn from Northampton County, not as a brother or close immediate relative, but as a trusted member of the same regional community. His service belonged to the most fragile months of the Revolution, when defeat seemed far more likely than victory, pretty much, I'm assuming, every day, certainly every battle that he took place in. Nicholas Kern was not related to Peter Kern. I know that through my genealogy, but likely since they came from the same area, Northampton, Bucks County, in that area in Pennsylvania, it was likely a cousin. What makes Peter Kern's story even more exciting to me is that he didn't serve alone. His brother Jacob Christopher Kern served during the American Revolution through the Northampton County Militia, specifically the 2nd Battalion. And Jacob Christopher Kern was born in 1745. And unlike the flying camp, county militia service was typically carried out in short-term call-ups, with men being mustered for weeks or months when threats arose and then returned home until they were needed again. So they were usually closer to home. And through my research, I found a third brother, Leonard Kern. He served through Pennsylvania's militia system during the war, and I wasn't able to find specific dates or battles that he may have been involved in. His inclusion in militia era records placed him among those who stepped forward when called, which kind of underscores how deeply this family, my ancestors, were involved in the struggle for independence. A brief recap: Peter was in the flying camp, Jacob, his brother, was in the county militia, and Leonard served through Pennsylvania's militia network. And that shows how this Kern family, these three brothers, answered the Revolution's call in multiple ways. That distinction matters because it shows how the war was carried by ordinary families in different but complementary ways. Peter left home for sustained service through the flying camp and faced the chaos of Long Island and Fort Washington and the Battle of White Plains, while his brothers served closer to home through the militia duty, responding when Pennsylvania itself was threatened. And together, I think these three brothers represent something that we often overlook about the Revolution, which is that it was not fought by isolated individuals or just one army. It was fought by families and communities, and all of them shared great risk. There was a moment when this story stopped being abstract for me, and that was the day that I stood at Peter Kern's grave. Seeing his name carved in stone, knowing he had stood in the chaos of 1776 and then returned home to build a life, changed how I understood and how I appreciated and looked at the American Revolution. It was no longer just battles and dates. It was, for me, personal. It was human and inherited. That visit ignited a passion that has stayed with me ever since. And it's the reason my next historical fiction book is called Taking Up Arms, The Pennsylvania Kern Brothers During the First Year of the Revolution. And that title is not about glory or violence. It's about ordinary men like Peter who took up arms because they wanted, not because they wanted war, but because, frankly, history gave them no other option. When Peter's service ended, he returned home and focused on building rather than resisting. And in 1806, he constructed Kern's grist mill and also a possible sawmill, which was an essential piece of infrastructure that supported local farmers and helped sustain the surrounding community that later became known as Kernsville. How cool is that? We were driving to the church where he attended and his gravesite, where he's buried, and I see the street sign and it's called Kernsville. I'm like, oh, that's wild. Could this city be named after my ancestors? It was pretty awesome. But that work mattered just as much as wartime service because independence only meant something if communities could survive afterwards. So ensuring that you could come back and build something for your community was imperative. And records show that he did that. And his grist mill was more than just a place to grind grain. Contemporary accounts, and I found a newspaper article, I think it was in the 30s, made it very clear that it was part of a larger working mill site along Trout Creek, likely including a sawmill and supporting structures that served the surrounding region. And the article also listed that Kern was an excellent builder. Man, I wished I could have inherited that. Being on a farm, that would come in handy. It was more than a mill. It was built to last. It was somewhere that travelers could stop, livestock could be watered, and trade could happen all year long. It also records that Native Americans traded at the mill, which reminds me that this was not just some isolated outpost, but it was a shared landscape where commerce crossed cultural lines. And in frontier Pennsylvania, mills like this functioned as local hubs, places obviously where grain was processed, but it was also where news was exchanged and community life quietly centered. The same site was later remembered as a place where timbers were made at the Associated Sawmill under Benjamin Franklin's direction, linking the Kern Mill property not just to daily life, but the broader story of Pennsylvania's early defense and settlement. And let me tell you, it was fascinating and, I have to agree, pretty exciting to find a newspaper article that mentions Peter Kern and Benjamin Franklin in the same sentence. That was pretty awesome. I don't think they met. I don't know. Maybe they did. But either way, that was pretty exciting for me. Peter lived until 1821, long enough to see the fragile experiment of independence become a functioning nation. His brother Jacob did not live as long. He passed away in 1793. But his service, like Leonard's, still belongs to that same generation who carried the revolution forward when it was uncertain and unfinished. And I made the trip to his gravesite and then to the mill, and I have those photos from that visit on our newly revamped website. We weren't supposed to go inside the mill, but I did. And the first thing I noticed was the smell, or the lack of one. It was not musty or stale, but it was like clean and open. And although pieces of wood were scattered around, the great beams remained solid, and the windows were open to the same outside air that once passed through pane glass centuries ago. At his gravesite, I was overcome by a feeling it's hard to describe. It was the realization that his life and his decisions were directly connected not only to my own existence, but the existence of the nation itself. And it's humbling to know that he and his brothers were brave enough to fight against the largest and most powerful army in the world at the time. And I took all pictures of his ancestry line as far back as I could go. And I took all the photos that I possibly could find and that I had, and I uploaded them and all the facial features and all of that, and turned it into a photo of Peter Kern on what he may have looked like. And I have no way of knowing if it's an accurate depiction, but it's all I have. And after so much research, it's nice to at least put a face to his name, even though it may not even be close. Maybe it's quite accurate. I don't know. I did put that photo on the website as well. None of these brothers were famous. None signed declarations or commanded armies. But the American Revolution depended on men like Peter, Jacob, and Leonard, men who stepped forward when needed, endured the war at its most fragile moment, and then returned to their families and communities when that call ended. There were thousands of men like my ancestors, and I'm grateful that you took the time to listen and learn about the three who are closest to my own story. And if this story matters to you the way it does to me, I feel it belongs not just on a website or in an archive, but in memory, shared and carried forward. That is their legacy, and it's exactly the kind of story worth remembering. For me, it feels perfect to open the first episode of 2026 this way. Thanks for listening, and hope that you tune in next time with us here at the Patriot Power Podcast. Make sure that you hit subscribe so you'll get notified when our new episodes are available for you. And we hope that you check out our websites, which include our show notes, links, documents, and more at patriotpowerpodcast.com or ilovegeorgewashington.com. Until next time, hope that you and your family have a blessed week. And remember, be safe and tell a veteran thanks for their service.